Okay, folks, so we are live. So for those listening at home, welcome to the Dungeon Musings YouTube channel. My name is Kevin Madison, and I will be your friendly Dungeon Muser today. Today, I wanted to hop on and talk about a project that I have coming up starting at the end of the month, beginning of next month, on the Dungeon Musings Patreon. Now, those of you who are regular viewers may not be aware that we have a Patreon. We have had a Patreon for a little while now, but I tend to not want to have anything hidden behind a paywall of any kind or anything like that on the channel, so we don't do any real Patreon exclusive things for the channel. And frankly, if people are going to support the channel financially, our preference is that you consider donating to the Heroes Save Villages charity campaign that we have on the channel that benefits SOS Children's Villages International. But we have seen quite a bit of growth on our Patreon over the last little while, so I wanted to give some. I have given some thought to what I'd like to do as a way of not only thanking the people who have been generously supporting us on Patreon, but also something that might be a little different from what we normally do on the channel, and something a little more personal as well too. So the project that I have in mind, I guess here's what this video is intended to do. It's going to tell you about the project, tell you why I'm doing the project, and tell you how you can support the project if you are inclined to do so. The project is going to be called the Savage Saga of the Fantastic Four. And I found there's a link to the Patreon, Dungeon Musings Patreon in the description below, which includes a accessible to everyone post on Patreon that is all about this project. So if you have further questions from this video that are not answered here, there's a bunch of options you have. You could post a comment in the comment of the video. You can reach me on Twitter at Dungeon Musings. You can email me. My email address is dungeonmusings@gmail.com. Or you can head on over to the Patreon and see if there's the questions are answered there. Let me quickly just make sure that our stream is going here. And we are. Terrific. Now, what the Savage Saga is I've described it as being, it's kind of equal parts a kind of a book club, it's kind of a game design blog, and it's kind of a historical overview of a particular period in American comic books. So what the plan is for it in a nutshell is that I intend to, every week, we're going to read a new issue of Fantastic Four, starting with issue 1. And then every week, I'm going to post stats on the Dungeon Musings Patreon for the characters that appeared in that. The characters, and some of that will be updated or changed stats based on their, how things have changed from the previous appearances. Stats for new characters, as well as I'm probably going to include some stuff for gear and whatnot as well. I'm also, all of those posts are also going to have commentary for why I made the decisions I did, for how I statted out the different characters or, species or the vehicles or equipment or whatever that they're seeing. And in addition, I guess I'm not sure if I'm going to do a video every week, but I'm certainly going to try and do a video at least every 6 issues. I may do one every week because I'm really enjoying the process so far. I've gotten about 5 issues or 6 issues in to work ahead of time and get that content ready to go. But let's talk about what I mean by the Savage one. So let's start with the whole thing, then we'll break it down into the different parts. So I call it Savage Saga because the game system I'm going to be using for converting the characters over or writing up the characters is going to be Savage Worlds Adventure Edition. And I'm going to be making use of the Explorer Edition version of the Superpowers Companion. Now, my plan isn't to necessarily go through the full run of the Fantastic Four. What I'm limiting myself to is the Kirby and Lee run. So that goes to issue 103, I believe, is the last issue that Jack Kirby worked on, and then Stan Lee kept writing for a bit, and then they had a change of creative teams. I can't remember, to be honest, if there are other creative teams, Lee working with someone else for the annuals, but it's going to cover all the annuals from that period as well. And basically, what that should give us is almost 2 years worth of, or a little more than 2 years worth of material on a week-by-week basis. So let's talk a little bit about why, I guess first off, why Fantastic Four. So the Fantastic Four itself is it's a super team that I've enjoyed. Regular viewers of the channel will know that I'm a big comic book fan and have been a long-time comic book fan. In the late 90s, I ran a comic book store as well, too. I've published a comic. I'm not a comic artist or anything like that. I dabble, but I mean, by no means I've ever worked professionally or anything like that. But it's something I've loved since I was a kid and have continued to love into adulthood. Fantastic Four is one of those teams that I have enjoyed on different creative teams. When John Byrne wrote it in the 80s, I was a huge fan. When John Hickman wrote it, I was a great fan of that as well. And there's a standalone book called Fantastic Four. What is it called? Jeez. Not Untold. It's, the artist who did it is a guy named Tom Scioli, and it is called Fantastic Four. Oh man, I remember the name. This is a lesson to write things down. And in any event, that one is a summary of of sort of the early years of Fantastic Four to give a comprehensive view or a comprehensive story of the entire Fantastic Four, and then writes a kind of like or does a revision of the story. But the thing is as much as I have been a fan of the Fantastic Four, I've never actually read the original Lee Kirby run. Part of that is price. I mean, when I was a kid, they didn't really have the bindings or the cheap versions of these books that you could pick up, and I certainly didn't have the money to buy the expensive ones. When they started collecting them in the Masterpiece collections, those were also out of my price range, and to be honest, at that age, they weren't really of my interest, or not something that was of interest to me. But at present, I guess for one thing, they've this year, in the time of recording, is 2021. This will be the 60th anniversary of the Fantastic Four, and there are a number of things that the comics are doing that is pretty exciting. But the period that we're, I guess this provides a good opportunity to go back and revisit those, because last year or 2 years ago, they published the first of these beautiful omnibuses, which collect a number of, it's like 28 or 30 issues of the Fantastic Four. And they're intending between now and November 2021, when the 60th anniversary will actually be, they're publishing the entire Jack Kirby and Stan Lee run in this format. And it is, they're not cheap by any means, but it is it's a really nice way to collect and read the entire series. If you don't want to read it in that format, there's still other ways to access those other older issues too, including there's some Essentials books that are put out that are black and white that are quite reasonably priced. You can access them on Marvel Unlimited, which is the digital site. There's the Masterpiece collections that I mentioned before, and there's another one that I can't remember the name of, but I mentioned on the blog because I took the time to do the research. So there's a bunch of different ways you can access these books now and actually read them, and that's all just the legal ways you can access it. So, and I imagine that there's a lot of viewers out there, or a lot of comic readers, who may not have who are in the same boat I am, long-term fans and whatnot, who just have never gone back and actually read the originals. So that was part of the reason for Fantastic Four. Also, as I mentioned, it's a 60th anniversary. When the other thing is that the Fantastic Four, the period that we're going to cover for this project, for the Savage Saga, it covers from November of 1961 up until September of 1970. And that is a phenomenally, phenomenally important, I guess, period of comic history. You know, we see an enormous amount. That's the birth of the Bronze Age. So the Marvel Age is maybe kind of the end of the Silver Age, or the tail end of the Silver Age. But we see the slow transformation into the Bronze Age of comics as well, too, where comics are more dealing with contemporary issues and things like that. And I honestly don't know whether the Fantastic Four delves into that later on. Yeah, and I guess so that, I think, in itself will be an interesting thing to see evolve, is how the stories change from these early kind of like pulp or like weird tales kind of stories featuring big monsters and, supernatural power-wielding villains, to the later period where we're dealing with the comic being cognizant of the fact that it's actually a very popular title. They get the name the Marvel's First Family at one point. They're routinely referenced as the world's greatest comic magazine, and they have, by the time of Jack Kirby departed the title, they have a huge mythos behind the comic as well too. So, and I guess that's the other period, is that just not thinking comics in general, but thinking of the Marvel Universe in the microcosm. Fantastic Four 1 is the one that the comic that launched the modern Marvel Universe. I know that there's characters in the Marvel Universe, that the comic universe, that had existed beforehand, like Captain America and the Human Torch and the Submariner. But this is the thing that presented that modern take on, or started the modern take on Marvel Comics. And over the course of those 100 issues, when I was doing research before I decided to actually commit to this, it's astounding how many signature Marvel concepts are introduced in those 100 issues, including a bunch of the, really important Marvel alien races, like the Skrull, the Kree, and, the Shi'ar are not, they're an X-Men creation, but the Skrull, the Kree, the, Galactus, Wakanda, the Silver Surfer, obviously, and the other Heralds of Galactus, Claw, the enemy for Black Panther, the Inhumans are introduced in this period. So there's it's really impressive how much of what became the fodder from what is Marvel continuity and the Marvel Universe is introduced in those early issues. So because of that, I guess for that thing, just from a practical perspective, the idea of what will be the work product at the end of this, when we're finished up this overview, the things we'll have is an enormous amount of stats and write-ups for characters and concepts and settings and equipment and whatnot that cover a huge amount of that classic or the things that make up a classic kind of Marvel setting. So that's why the Fantastic Four. I thought it'd be really interesting. And I guess another thing I should mention as well is the idea that the Fantastic Four actually evolved over time as well too. Partly not only in terms of their capabilities, their powers, but also what they really are. Like, again, I've only gone about 5 issues in right now, but it's interesting to see that, like, it's 3 issues before they get costumes. It's 3 issues before they're identifying themselves as like the Fantastic Four, and as a publicly known super team kind of by issue 2. But it's not until issue 3 that they get things like, we see what will later be known as the Baxter Building. We see costumes first come out, but we also see evolution of powers as well too, which is interesting because I think that in one of the things I've always struggled with for RPGs, for superhero RPGs, is the concept of characters constantly adding new powers, right? That is a fairly modern thing, or at least I thought of it as something, having grown up in the 80s and read through into the 90s and whatnot, and seeing the sort of unnecessary escalation of power that came with characters in the 90s, whether that was what passed for storytelling. It actually is right from the get-go. We see these characters slowly evolving and adding powers. Susan Storm gets different powers over time. Johnny Storm gets different powers over time. Ben Grimm changes the look of him over time as well. And we slowly see things added. And there's a reason why I think that Savage Worlds will be particularly interesting for modeling this stuff. So maybe let's turn and talk about that. So why Savage? There is regular viewers of the channel will know that I'm a fan of most superhero role-playing games, and in particular games like Champions, Marvel Superheroes, and DC Heroes. With all of those options available, why on earth would I want to go with Savage Worlds? Particularly something that I haven't run as a superhero thing on any ongoing basis on the channel. Well, it's a good question. My answer to that is, I guess, for one, there's something about Savage Worlds that I think is, especially in this most recent edition, that really suits a lot of the elements of superhero role-playing. There are games, broadly speaking, the kind of like superhero RPGs that are out there and available at present seem to fit into one of 2 different sort of modes. And I mean, this is obviously extreme kind of, straw man of these things, so the reality lies a little bit in between, but there is games that really try to simulate what it would be like to have characters who have superpowers in a role-playing game format, modeling how much damage it does, how far you fly, and things like that. And then games that try and model what the experience of reading comic books is like. So on the former, I definitely put games like Champions is like that, GURPS Supers is like that, And then as we're getting a little closer to that middle range, Marvel superheroes is kind of closer to that end. Same thing with DC heroes. Same thing with like Heroes Unlimited. As we get to the other side, the far extreme, you've got games like the Marvel Heroic role-playing, the one that was put up by Margaret Weis Productions, which really tries to simulate more the feel of reading comic books and the stories that are told in those. I have not played it, I have not read it, but I understand that the new game Spectaculars is very much like that. Masks, the new generation, is very much like that as well. But the interesting thing with Savage Worlds is it feels like it's a little bit closer to that middle range. For those who aren't familiar with Savage Worlds, the game not only has robust kind of rules for the things you would expect in a role-playing game like combat and social interaction and all that kind of stuff. It also has a ton of different interesting subsystems that can be used to sort of gamify other elements of play, the way that, or other parts of your play experience, the way that more indie games do, or more Apocalypse Worlds type inspired story-based games kind of adopt. So Savage Worlds fits in this kind of interesting middle range where you've got some of the game mechanic structures that you can use in story games and things like that to model different parts of your experience. So like the downtime, or dealing with your regular life, or searching out information, or long-term tasks like searching down, trying to track down information on the where the supervillains are hiding. All of that stuff is present in the basic rules for Savage Worlds. So I think that in and of itself is a good starting point, because comic books aren't just about fighting, right? Like the comic books are about character development, they're about character interaction, and more to the point, the Fantastic Four is very much about that. The dynamic between the characters and their adversaries is a very crucial part of what makes up a Fantastic Four experience, like a Fantastic Four story. The Super's Companion is something that is very interesting too. So one of the things that I find most interesting about it, not only is it has a good selection of superpowers and gives some great examples of how to build characters. There are some really good rules for modeling the kind of thing that some superhero role-playing games struggle with, which is improvised use of powers. A lot of those games that fit closer into that crunchier simulationist side of the spectrum for superhero games, they have a hard time, unless you've intentionally built your character that way, they have a hard time modeling the kind of thing you see in comic books and other superhero fiction, like films and cartoons and stuff like that, where characters use their powers in really inventive ways that have not been anticipated before. Now, to save some commenters, I know that there are certain ways you can model that stuff in those different games, particularly in Champions, but and you can add house rules in. I'm just talking about the games at a default. One of the nice things with this is it not only gives you the rules for improvising those types of circumstances, it also it takes advantage of another subsystem in Savage Worlds called tests. That is kind of like a way of affecting an adversary or some other character without violence. It's intimidating them or tricking them or whatever, and you can extrapolate that with powers as well too. So you can allow the players to be really inventive, particularly those with actual superpowers as opposed to like high tech gear or big training or lots of training or whatever. So that to me feels like the type of four-colored experience that I'd want. I also find that Savage Worlds plays very quickly, so I like that quite a bit as well. The numbers that you're dealing with in this and the math in the Super's Companion is much more manageable than other types of superhero or comparable point generation systems. Silver Age Sentinels or the Authority role-playing game are awful for how much math you have to do. Champions is up there as well too. There's a lot of math you need to do. You can learn it and get to know it intuitively, but you can't really get away from it. This is a little easier, which means that if you need to calculate a power and balance it on the fly, it's a lot easier to do that than it is in some other games. And it does a thing in it that I think is really something I haven't seen in a lot of other games. like not a lot of the other superhero games, the points you use to build your character's powers in this is separate from the points you use to build your character. So you build a character. The Aberrant RPG does something similar to this, where you build a character and then you build your superpowered character on top of that. This is even a little different. Well, I mean, that's not true. I guess it's around the same type of thing, but it what it allows you to do is build a character. You can have what your powers are, and you set the power level. Like if you want to play pulp heroes, you get X amount of points. If you want to play cosmic, surfboard riding, omniscient or not omniscient, omnipotent characters. You can, I don't know why I pronounce omnipotent that way, but if you want to be able to character, you can do that too. But then you can also go through the regular experience process of Savage Worlds. So you can gain new skills and things like that are independent of your superpowers. And I really like that a lot, because for me it solves one of the problems I've always had with for instance, Mutants and Masterminds. Mutants and Masterminds, even up to the most recent edition, one of the challenges I have with that is that the experience points is the exact same thing that measures your power level. So you get power points, you're going to get to a certain point where you're going to go up in another tier. And there are definitely examples in comics of seeing characters do that, but if you play games at the rate that, or the frequency that I often do, you will find characters that start off feeling like they are Robin the Boy Wonder and will end up feeling like, something that would be a credible threat for Batman and all of his family, because the power level just goes up so quickly. This sidesteps that nicely, which allows you to advance the character and see things change without seeing the characters operate in a different power tier. Now, one of the ways that you can, if you do want to have that experience of seeing characters start off as fledgling heroes and gradually gain more powers and such, the game also offers a way of doing that. And that is called, what is it called? Rising Stars. So what you do is you get about half of the points that you would normally get, and then as your character gains experience, you can choose to invest some of your advancements, the thing you get as your character gets experience, into gaining new powers or expanding out your powers. So that's all. I mean, that for me feels like, having read this first couple of issues of Fantastic Four, feels like it'll be a great match for the Fantastic Four, because we see almost all of the characters develop and exhibit new powers, and not just in one-time expressions of what their powers are going to be like. I mean, like regular new abilities they will call on. Johnny Storm in the first few issues, the Human Torch, he doesn't throw fire. He doesn't have that ability yet. He is able to get close to stuff and burn it, but that's the extent of it, like bringing a torch close to thing. It's not until later on that he's able to zing fireballs and things like that and shape, make fire shapes. So for that reason, I think Savage Worlds will be a good fit for this. For those who aren't familiar with Savage Worlds as well, the byline for that, or the sort of advertising, slogan for the game, has always been fast, furious, and fun. And that, to me, also captures, in particular, these early issues of Fantastic Four, where you're introduced to, you see them put their plan into motion, and then you see them defeated for every supervillain for the first, bunch of issues. It's really going to be necessary to have that sort of, that exciting kind of pace. So the last thing I guess I may anticipate as a question here is, why weekly? Why do this weekly? Why not just do a write-up of the different characters and then just post them as sort of signature versions of the character or iconic versions of the characters? That's what a lot of folks do when they're doing write-ups. And that's a perfectly valid approach, but there's a couple of reasons for that. Some of them gaming-related and some of them just narrative-related. Narrative, let's do it with the reverse order. So narratively, or I guess just as part of the experience, I really do want to read each of these issues and really ponder them and consider them. Like I want this to be a purposeful read-through. One of the things I find, and I'm sure a lot of other folks do, because of the accessibility of comic books nowadays and the volume, if you are a fan, you're probably not reading one or two titles. You're probably reading a lot of titles, and you may be picking up reading them electronically or whatnot. I tend to breeze through comics more so than actually absorb them the way I did when I was a kid. When I was a kid and I was much more limited in my funds and only had my stack of comics and whatnot, I'd read those things over and over and over again. And I can tell you that, like, for the reason that some of those old stories are just lodged in my brain is not necessarily because they were terrific. Some of them were, for sure, but not all of them. There's issues that are definitely subpar issues, but they've lodged themselves in my brain. And that's because I read them over and over and over and really thought about them and, talked to my cousins about them and talked about how it related to the Marvel Superheroes game or the DC Heroes game that we were playing, right? Yeah, so I want to, for these particular issues, I really want to take my time and absorb every one of them. And by forcing myself to come up with rationales for the write-ups for these characters, it really makes me pay attention to what is happening and what has happened before and seeing what's going on in those. And that has already been really fun, for the first couple of issues that I've read, because it's interesting to note really what's going on. Like, it's easy to breeze past some of these older stories and think, like, because they don't necessarily have long-term consequences in the greater scheme of things. But, at the start, there was about a 2-month gap between, sometimes 3-month gap between when these issues were released. And in issue 4 is when the Submariner is reintroduced to the Marvel Universe. And at one point, Submariner introduces effectively a whale man kaiju called Titano, and Titano destroys a good chunk of Manhattan, and that's that is insane. Like, to from a modern context, to think of that scale of tragedy happening, and Titano is eventually killed. I won't spoil it for those who, I guess I just did spoil it, so my apologies for those who may get attached to or thought they may be attached to Titano. The thing is that's interesting is that, like, if you'd read just that issue, that's the thing you'd be thinking about and talking about and considering. You'd be really like, holy crap, like, Submariner just destroyed part of New York. And I want to have that experience. I want to be able to really go through it and take my time and dwell on the consequence of each one of these stories. And I want the folks who may be following along in the Patreon to go through the same experience. The other thing is that we run a fair amount of long-term campaigns on the Dungeon Musings YouTube channel as well. We've got at the time of recording, our Night Below campaign is into its 115 range right now, and our Crystal Shard, Legacy of the Crystal Shard game is in the 70s, as is our Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerers of Hyperborea. And there are things that have been interesting that I've learned over the course of running those campaigns, and things that I've adapted when other campaigns have come after them. I have changed some things or tried new things or made sure to do certain things again. By approaching the write-up and the exercise, or the write-up of these characters and this exercise from the perspective of these being at first starting characters and then seeing them evolve over the course of the series, I think there might be some interesting lessons that might be learned in terms of pacing of story, in terms of how to keep engagement up. I know that it's easy to look back on this now. There are, I think, 700 issues into Fantastic Four, 600 or 700 issues at the time of recording, and to think that this was a foregone conclusion, but it's good to remember that Fantastic Four was a Hail Mary. It was really a thing of, like, let's just throw something at the wall and see what happens, because we're otherwise shutting the lights off and shuttering the building. And it seems like through a combination of that kind of boldness and also the necessity, you see some really interesting things and interesting mistakes as well too. In the second issue of Fantastic Four, there is a fourth scroll. There's a fourth Skrull, I should say, that just inexplicably goes missing, and they give a cockamamie explanation in the text for it, because those who may not be familiar with, and forgive me those who are, but the Marvel method, the way of they make comics, was generally Stan Lee would describe a situation, or he and the artist would discuss a situation. That artist would then go off, create the comic. It would come back to Stan, and Stan would add dialogue to it. And that there was not always clear communication throughout, and there was a crap ton of books that were coming out at the time, so it was very much at a breakneck pace. But in the second issue, there's just this scroll that goes missing, and I honestly thought I was like, am I missing something here? And I read online afterwards that it was just there was a communication error between Stan and Jack, and one one of the scrolls just went missing. So Stan gave an explanation that makes no sense in the context of the issue. And then later, comic writers would actually make use of that stuff to feed further story. Roy Thomas made use of that missing scroll in the classic Kree Skrull War storyline from the Avengers. But it's one of those errors that I expect we're going to see going forward. And it's also what I love too is this is regular viewers of the channel have heard me mention the No Prize before, where it's something that Marvel Comics used to give, where if you pointed out an error in their story, a continuity error, but then explained that story, you would get what's called a No Prize. And you see in the letters column, because the omnibus reproduces these, you see the award, like the evolution of that, where people are pointing stuff out, and initially they're like, give us a reason for why it's not a mistake. Yeah, you point out a mistake, but tell us why it isn't a mistake, and we'll give you $5. And then I imagine that accounting told Stan, don't fucking do that. Just so it became this No Prize. And that idea of embracing the errors and building story from it is something that I think that is a great lesson that you can learn for those who run ongoing campaigns, particularly those who are adults who have shit going on, and you may forget something from earlier sessions, and then you know on review of your notes or watching the session, if you stream your games, you see, oh, okay, I made a mistake there, or I forgot something, but let's come up with an in-universe explanation for why that's not actually a mistake. A No Prize for yourself. So that's what I'm expecting as well, is that there will be some really interesting lessons to be learned from seeing how this story and this world came together over the course of this first 107, I want to say, issues. I may be wrong about that, but that's it. So I thought it would be there's those lessons that may be learned as well too. So in total, I guess what it means is that it will be every week we get to dive back into these classic comics from the golden age of Marvel, not the golden age of Marvel Comics, but like what would be known as the shared Marvel universe, right? And comics historians, you don't need to point out to me that Human Torch and Submariner teamed up in the Golden Age. I know, so let's try and not fight over nomenclature on this. From Fantastic Four going forward is where we get the modern Marvel universe, and I'm excited to see how that stuff comes together and the things that get abandoned, because a lot of us also, just to tie us back to role-playing games, because we are a role-playing game channel, one of the things that I enjoy the most about a lot of old school games, and why I also like using like pre-gens or without characters without extensive backstory when they first come to the table in my games, is because that sort of course correction that inevitably happens early on in an RPG campaign is so interesting as you get to know the players, you get to know their characters, and you get to know how both the characters and players all sort of work together and in concert with the emerging story. For an ongoing, like for a one-shot, that's a different issue, but for an ongoing campaign, there is always going to be an element of like, okay, let's just see, the characters are responding to this more than that, or the players are, I should say. And that's absolutely what's happening in this comic as well, too. You're seeing them actively responding to what people are suggesting in the letters columns, or because that's how they, that was their internet forum before. Seeing what people were saying they liked or they didn't like, or whatever, what they wanted to see back, or whatever crazy idea that Jack or Stan or both wanted to throw against the wall and see what stuck. So, yeah. So that's the project. I mean, it's a long-term thing. Every Monday, if you are a Patreon or patron of the Dungeon Musings Patreon, you'll be able to access all of these things. And I'm not like, once this project is off its feet, to anyone who gets on, joins at the $1 level, you're going to have access to everything. So if you only come to this later, if you find this video as we're far into the project, you're going to be able to jump on and get caught up immediately, and then you can feel free to unsubscribe as well too. The Patreon is really a luxury that we've been using to help basically to help thank our players for their participation on in the games on the channel. So this will give a little something extra, hopefully, for the people who are on the Patreon. And then if you do want to follow along with this, if you have been putting off reading Fantastic Four yourself or whatever. And again, like, you don't need to get the omnibus to be able to get to participate in the reading. Marvel Universe, or the Marvel Ultimate, I think it's called, is the online resource. There's cheap, like, I think they're $15 American, maybe $10 American essentials books you can get that are black and white, but they give the full story for them. The printing was so crap in some of these earlier comics anyway that seeing them in black and white doesn't rob a huge amount of the experience. Yeah, but I mean, if you are interested in following along the omnibus format, the nice thing is by November, we're going to have the entire run there. So apart from the actual Fantastic Four comics, the only other mechanical things, if you do want to take full advantage of it, is a copy of the Explorer Edition Superpowers Companion and the Adventure Edition. I'm also I'm having to make these. There are some small changes so that these two are not necessarily completely compatible, but I'm going to explain what those changes, or at least the ones I've made. And then over the course of this project, if we do see an Adventure Edition version of the Superpowers Companion come out, I'll probably go back and I'll rework some of the characters just to fit up. Or I might, I don't know. We'll see. It depends on how different the changes are. But because the changes between the two editions are really not so substantial between Explorer and Adventure Edition. The last thing I'd say is just, if all you want to do is just follow along and see have some commentary about the evolution of the Fantastic Four as it goes along, and you don't really care about reading ahead, or you don't really care about the game mechanics, there's going to be something for you there in these posts as well. We're going to talk about how the characters, not only their powers and such, but also their personalities. It's surprising right from the get-go just how much of, at least for me it was, how much of a really selfless hero Johnny Storm is. He evolves fairly quickly into the kind of antagonistic hothead that becomes his defining character trait later on in the comics. But in these early ones, it's amazing that Johnny is the one who really kind of saves the day in a couple of different circumstances. And then, of course, that becomes a point of friction within the Fantastic Four, and one of the first times that Johnny and Ben, the Thing, really kind of come to blows or close to blows in it. So it is, yeah. And I guess the last thing I'll say with respect to Savage Worlds, because Savage Worlds, like a lot of point generation systems, has hindrances or disadvantages. They're called hindrances in the game, but they're like disadvantages. Things that are, make your hero into a hero with feet of clay. That is so early Marvel. Like, these characters each have fundamental character flaws that that would, in a game context, make for a great source of story and drama in the course of playing their adventures. In some of these cases, these characters are they're victims of their own personalities or their own, temperaments. And I think that is very much in fitting with how Savage Worlds portrays their heroes. Yet you're not a character who is free from any kind of, interesting peccadillos like a temper, or you are overly heroic, or you've hideously deformed, or you're a wallflower. So anyway, that is the project. So that is what, and if of course, like, if this doesn't interest you whatsoever, that's completely fine. This is it is something that I thought would be a fun side project that incorporates a lot of different things that I enjoy, and hopefully give something of interest for the supporters of the Dungeon Musings Patreon to look forward to every Monday. This will be kicking off on Monday, May 31st. Monday, May 31st, if you are a patron of the Dungeon Musings Patreon, you will find the first issue of the Fantastic Four, completely with all the characters in it, my complete commentary for why I set up built the characters the way I did, and then I'm probably going to shoot, because it's the first issue, I'll shoot a video for it as well too. That will be accessible for patrons and patrons exclusive, because it really, without the stats and the entry, there's not really much for you to enjoy about it. If you do intend to join, if you're listening at the time of recording or before May 31st, and you're going to jump on and join us, be sure to read that first issue beforehand too, because there will be spoilers as we go forward. I mean, spoilers on a almost 60-year-old comic book, but still, there are some things that I found over the course of reading those, even just these early issues, that I had forgotten or didn't realize that there were certain ways that things were presented. In fact, like in the second issue, it's not a test flight that they're supposed to have been on. It's referred to as being a trip to Mars. That is completely ignored afterwards. But in the second issue, it's presented as if they were going to Mars on a lark, on a stolen starship. So that's the kind of thing that I think will be fun about this this whole exercise is learning those things and figuring out how we could, how that stuff would look if it was in a role-playing context. Anyway, I'll end the video here. I'm already, half an hour? No, 40 minutes. So once again, almost an hour long. As is always the case, if you have any comments, questions, or concerns regarding this exercise or the project and the Savage Saga or the Fantastic Four, please do not hesitate to leave a comment in the comment section of the video. You can reach me by email at dungeonmusings@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at Dungeon Musings, and you can find a link to the Dungeon Musings Discord server down in the description below. We're going to have a channel set up just for the Patreon. The Patreon chatter as well too about this particular project. So if you want to talk about it, or you want to talk about how other I don't know, like whatever things you may want to talk about or discuss about this, the builds that I'm going to be presenting are just my takes on them. So other people may have different feelings on it or different approaches, which is great. One of the things I did always enjoy about the Hero Games forums and the Mutants and Masterminds forums, the Atomic Think Tank, was seeing how different people would have different approaches for building the exact same character. That's going to be interesting. And it's been a long time since I've done any actual game design work like this, so that will be interesting as well. Otherwise, I hope that if you're joining us during the current crisis, this finds you healthy and safe and weathering the current crisis as well as can be expected. I hope that I gave you a little while to have some interesting perspective on what's to come on the Dungeon Musings Patreon. And until we see you again, stay safe, stay healthy, and happy gaming.